Welcome to The Explainer. We're currently living through one of the most massive, sweeping transformations in modern history. We're looking at a rapidly shifting global power landscape. If you've been watching the news lately and kind of feeling like the tectonic plates of global politics are just moving right beneath your feet, well, you're not imagining it. The rules of the game are absolutely changing. So today, we're going to break down exactly how and why. It's basically the defining geopolitical riddle of our time. For decades, the global hierarchy felt, well, set in stone. But with everything happening today, rapidly advancing military buildups, fragmented financial markets, shifting alliances, and these major global summits that are actively excluding traditional Western powers, a totally new reality is emerging. So is the world still dominated by one superpower, or are we entering an entirely new era of competing giants? Let's find out.
Section 1. Era of Competing Giants, Defining the Board.
Okay, before we analyze the players, we really have to understand the board itself. We do that using an academic concept called polarity. Essentially, this is just the distribution of power among great states in the international system. Think of it like a giant boardroom table, right? In a unipolar system, you have a table with just one leader sitting at the head, making all the final calls. But in a multipolar system, that same table is crowded. You've got several heavy-hitting power players, all competing for influence, leverage, and of course, the best seat. For a long time, we fluctuated between two very different tables. During the Cold War, we lived in a bipolar system. Two dominant superpowers, the US and the USSR, basically staring each other down, keeping this tense, highly structured balance. But then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we entered a unipolar system. Throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, the United States just sat at the head of the table alone, exercising undisputed military, economic, and technological dominance. Which brings us to Section 2, the fall of unipolarity, a paradigm shift. Okay, let's dive into this. In 1991, the unipolar era kicked off, and it ushered in what we call the golden age of hyperglobalization throughout the 90s and 2000s. The whole goal was to remove barriers to global trade and expand a liberal international order. But here is the fascinating twist. That very hyperglobalization unintentionally empowered rival nations. It rapidly accelerated the economic growth of countries way outside the traditional power center. So, by the time the 2008 financial crisis shook up the system's stability, the stage was already set for the 2010s. We saw the dramatic rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the emergence of the BRICS nations. And just like that, the undisputed unipolar era came to a close. You see, history demonstrates a cyclical transition of global power. It's an endless cycle of rising and falling empires. Just as we shifted from a multipolar Europe in the 19th century into bipolarity, and then into unipolarity, the wheel is spinning rapidly once again. The momentum is literally pulling us away from a single hegemonic power and pushing us right back into a complex, fragmented balance. Section 3. Key players in focus, the competing giants. So, who exactly sits at this crowded table today? Well, the United States remains the military hegemon, operating over 120 overseas bases, and their goal is to maintain the liberal order and focus on containment. China, on the other hand, has emerged as an absolute economic powerhouse, driving aggressively toward high-tech dominance and regional control. Then there's Russia, sitting as a nuclear peer, focused heavily on disruption and carving out its own Eurasian order. Meanwhile, the European Union leverages its massive regulatory and services weight to seek strategic autonomy. And finally, you have India and the BRICS nations wielding vast influence over the global south, actively working to build alternative financial systems. But we do need to keep the facts in perspective here. While the world is undoubtedly changing, the United States still accounts for roughly 40% of nominal global defense spending. China, its closest competitor, spends less than 20%. So when it comes to sheer traditional military hardware and global reach, the military sphere still retains a heavily unipolar flavor. Now, what's really interesting about this next piece of data is that the economic reality tells a completely different story. As far back as 2014, the IMF calculated that China actually surpassed the US in purchasing power parity, producing 17% of global GDP compared to the US's 16%. I mean, this stunning economic catch-up is the real wedge driving into American dominance. It's literally the engine powering this entire geopolitical shift. And the gravity of this shift? It's recognized across the political spectrum in the West. Just look at this quote from US Senator Marco Rubio. He says, Communist China is the most powerful adversary the United States has faced in living memory. This perfectly illustrates the intense, bipartisan realization that today's competition just isn't like the Cold War. The Soviet Union never had an economy that could truly rival the US, but China does, making it a true peer competitor. And we can't forget, the shift isn't just about the US and China. Listen to this insight from Indian External Affairs Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar. He says, the BRICS itself is a statement of how profoundly the old order is changing. Emerging economies are simply no longer content playing by rules they didn't write. They're actively seeking to challenge Western-centric institutions, like the IMF, the World Bank, and the SWIFT financial networks, all to build systems that serve their own interests. Section 4. Drivers of the shift, from free trade to geoeconomics. So why is this happening beneath the surface? The mechanics have completely changed. First, we're seeing a massive retreat from the absolute free trade and hyperglobalization that defined the 90s. Second, nations have realized that global supply chains can actually be used against them. This is the weaponization of interdependence. Think about it. If you rely on a rival for energy or microchips, that's a huge vulnerability. Which leads us to step 3, the shift to strategic geoeconomics. Countries are now using trade barriers, tariffs, and industrial policy not just to boost their economies, but as outright geopolitical weapons. To summarize, there are really 4 core structural forces pushing the world away from U.S. unipolarity. You have the massive economic rise of Asia. You have the relative decline of Western dominance. You've got fierce, intense competition for physical resources like rare earth elements. And, perhaps most importantly, you have a relentless technological arms race. Because the true battleground of modern geopolitics? It's increasingly digital. The competition for technological superiority in areas like artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, and quantum computing has become just as crucial, if not more so, than traditional military might. The country that controls the tech of tomorrow is going to hold immense sway over the entire global order. Section 5. A multi-order future, beyond multipolarity. Now, this is where things get really wild. Some top researchers suggest we aren't just entering multipolarity, we're entering a multi-order or multiplex world. This is a highly fragmented global architecture where overlapping, completely contradictory sets of rules and values exist simultaneously. I mean, think about the gravity of that for a second. We aren't just seeing competing states playing on the same board anymore. We're seeing entirely different competing systems of rules. The board itself is breaking apart. And this brilliantly illustrates the distinction. Over on the left, traditional multipolarity means you have many powers, sure, but they still mostly operate under one global rulebook, like the UN or the WTO. But on the right, a multi-order world means many powers with competing rulebooks. It basically means the end of universalism. It suggests a future where the US, China, and maybe others lead their own isolated, bounded orders, complete with entirely distinct technological, financial, and political ecosystems. Leading scholars are already sounding the alarm on the massive geopolitical implications here. The liberal international order, which was established right after World War II, risks literally splitting in two or fracturing into several distinct pieces. Going forward, the relationships within these new orders are going to become just as critical as the relationships between them. Now, this isn't just some abstract academic theory. It's happening right now in our daily headlines. The friction of this shifting system is already causing intense, real-world instability. The devastating Russia-Ukraine war, the escalating military tensions over in the South China Sea, ongoing trade wars, the heavy use of sanctions, and the fragmentation of historical alliances, these are all undeniable symptoms of an international order going through a profound and frankly painful metamorphosis. So what does all this mean? It really leaves us with this final, lingering question. Will multipolarity bring balance or chaos? Will this massive paradigm shift eventually settle into a fairer, more representative world where power is actually shared? Or are we just strapping in for an era of unprecedented instability and systemic conflict? The global chessboard has basically been flipped, and the next moves are going to determine the future of our world. I highly encourage you to keep looking into this because this shift affects absolutely everything. Thanks for tuning into The Explainer and keep your eyes on the board.
欢迎来到本期解析。今天我们要聊的主题正在彻底重塑你我的未来，那就是单一全球秩序的终结，以及一个极度复杂，甚至有点碎片化的新世界的诞生。说真的，我们从小习以为常、按部就班运作的那个世界、那个时代已经过去了。 这可不只是新闻头条里无聊的政治术语，这是一场实实在在的典范转移。我们真的跟过去30年的游戏规则说再见，准备好迎接一个充满变数的新时代。
其实，国际关系学者约翰·米尔斯海默早就精准地点出了这个现象。他认为，冷战后由美国主导的自由主义体系，从一开始就埋下了自我毁灭的种子，崩溃是迟早的事。这句话听起来超级震撼，对吧？但如果我们拨开表象去检视深层的结构，你会发现，哇，这结论真的太一针见血了。为了帮大家理清这个庞大又看似混乱的新格局，我们今天的路线图很明确，我们会从单极时代的终结开始，一路聊到多重秩序的崛起，去美元化的趋势，关键矿产的白热化争夺，最后再来看看欧洲该如何自处。好，我们直接切入第一部分，曾经无可动摇的单极时代，究竟是如何又为什么开始走向瓦解的？
这里最关键的一点是，大家常常以为自由秩序是受到外部挑战才崩溃的，但其实不然，它内部本身就藏着致命的结构性缺陷。没错，过度全球化确实创造了惊人的财富，但代价呢，是严重的贫富不均、工作流失，还有薪资停滞。这些不平等直接引爆了各国国内的政治反弹。像是美国的 Mega 运动就是个客观存在、非常鲜明的例子。更讽刺的是，这个超级开放的经济体系，还在无意中成了竞争对手国快速崛起的温床，等于是它从内部被自己给削弱了。
我们可以这样理解这个典范转移。过去那个黄金时代，大家想的是怎么一起把饼做大，追求绝对收益跟互惠互利。但现在呢，情况完全变了。我们一脚踏进了战略竞争时代，经济联系不再只是为了赚钱，而是被当作国家安全的武器。现在各国在乎的是，我绝对不能赢得比你少，也就是所谓的相对收益。关税跟制裁反而成了家常便饭。
既然单极体系正在崩解，那接下来接棚的是什么？这就带我们来到第二部分，多重秩序世界的崛起。针对这个新世界，很多顶尖学术机构，像是英国科学院的报告，都在大声呼吁决策者，拜托别再说现在是个多极世界了。为什么？因为多极这个词太扁平了，它只看到军事力量的分配，却完全忽略了现在这个世界到底有多复杂。
取而代之的，我们正在进入一个多重秩序的世界。简单来说，这不光是看谁的拳头大，而是一个由不同地区、不同集团各自拿着完全不同的经济和政治剧本在玩耍的世界。大家想象一下，在同一个棋盘上，有人在下西洋棋，有人却在下围棋，规则完全重叠，甚至互相冲突。这就是我们现在面临的新现实。
接着进入第三部分，我们来看看这种混乱的多重秩序是如何蔓延到金融领域的，特别是金砖国家加的联盟的动态。
要衡量他们现在的地缘政治分量，只要想一下这个数字就知道了，37%。扩编后的金砖国家集团现在占了全球 GDP 的37%，更涵盖了全球将近一半的人口。这已经是个拥有庞大市场和资源的巨无霸。
站在客观的角度来看，金砖国家正在非常务实地铺路，试图绕过美元，打造一个去中心化的多极金融体系，这点真的非常引人注目。他们不仅推动用本国货币结算贸易，还发展用黄金、石油做担保的机制，甚至积极投入区块链和新型数位结算网络。这些动作背后的核心目标只有一个：摆脱对 SWIFT 或国际货币基金组织这些西方主导机构的依赖。这就像是在旧的高速公路旁边悄悄盖起一座座全新的高架桥。
当然呢，我们得说实话，美元的霸权不可能明天一早就突然消失。但总结来说，这些倡议绝对是几十年来美元在全球主导地位所面临到的第一次，也是最真实的结构性挑战。全球金融的游戏规则并不是刻在石头上，永远不会变的。
第四部分，我们要把视角从无形的货币战场转移到非常实际的地球实体资源争夺战。
说真的，现在去抢锂钴、稀土这些关键矿产，早就不是单纯为了什么环保或是绿能转型了，这已经是大国竞争跟国家经济安全的绝对最前线。谁掌握了这些矿产，谁就等于掐住了未来科技跟军事发展的命脉。
我们摊开各国的战略优先事项来看，对比非常强烈。中国在矿产加工和供应链控制上有着绝对优势，俄罗斯则是全球能源与矿产的出口大户。反观美国和欧盟，他们正急得像热锅上的蚂蚁，拼命想保护那些极度脆弱的科技跟军事供应链。美国甚至祭出了有案外包的策略，想把盟友拉进自己的资源圈里。这彻头彻尾就是一场活生生的零和博弈。
而这种严重的资源焦虑跟脆弱性，直接把我们带到第5部分，欧洲的战略自主。来看看欧盟在这个杀气腾腾的环境中怎么反应。夹在美中2个超级大国的明争暗斗之间，加上以前那种跨大西洋的安全感已经慢慢消失，欧盟现在可以说是迫切地在寻找一条出路。他们称这条第3条路为战略自主。
但欧洲现在最大的软肋就在于，他们对竞争对手的依赖度实在太高了，高达60%以上的消费品依赖中国进口，同时还有约20%的关键能源跟化学品依赖美国或俄罗斯。在现在这个贸易随时会被当成武器的世界里，这种高度依赖简直就像是把自家大门的钥匙交给了随时可能会翻脸的邻居一样危险。
所以为了在这个新世界活下去欧盟正在采取非常具体的反制行动。他们不再天真地完全相信自由市场，而是开始转向更强硬、更具保护色彩的产业政策，采用反胁迫的贸易工具，努力在某些关键科技领域让自己变得无可取代，甚至开始推动整合国家军队跟联合采购。这一切都是为了建立起自己的防御韧性。最后，让我们拉高视角，来展望一下2035年的全球架构。综合许多专家学者的分析预测，到了2035年，我们大概会处于一种高度动荡的松散两极化状态。随着旧有自由秩序的不断瓦解，这种由竞争集团和不结盟国家拼凑出来的碎片化系统，将会变成永久的新常态。特别是全球南方的国家，他们为了避险，会越来越懂得在强权之间灵活游走，采取不结盟的立场。同时，我们也会看到越来越多足以跟联合国或国际货币基金组织抗衡的平行全球机构持续冒出来。在今天这期解析的尾声，我想留给大家一个发人深省的问题：当单一的普世规则不再适用，21世纪我们面临的终极挑战将是这些截然不同甚至互相冲突的全球秩序到底能不能找到一种和平共享同一个地球的方式，而不至于引爆全面性的系统灾难。这是一个没有标准答案的大哉问，但它绝对值得我们每一个人持续关注。感谢大家的陪伴，我们下次解析见。
Right now, like at this very second, the United States and China are actively preparing their militaries, running war games, and developing weapon systems that are specifically designed for a potential, catastrophic conflict with one another.
Yeah, it's a terrifying reality to think about.
Right. But then by the time the sun sets today, those same two countries will have traded roughly $2 billion worth of goods and services.
Exactly. $2 billion in a single day.
It's mind-blowing. They are each other's greatest existential threat, but simultaneously, they're indispensable economic lifelines. So how does a global system function when the whole architecture of trade is built on a foundation of, mutual escalating distrust?
That is really the defining paradox of our era. I mean, we are living through a period where the fundamental laws of geopolitical physics they're failing us.
I was actually trying to visualize this for the deep dive today, and the best way I can frame it for you listening is astronomical.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, for the last 30 years, we've essentially operated in a unipolar solar system. We had one sun, the United States, and its gravitational pull was so massive, so undisputed, that it kept all the other planetary bodies in these predictable designated orbits.
Right. You knew exactly where the center of gravity was.
Yeah.
Which made the system stable.
comforting, even if you were aligned with that sun. But you look at the daily news cycle today, the chaotic headlines about sweeping tariffs, aggressive new alliances, localized wars, and it feels as though we've woken up in a galaxy where a second and maybe a third sun have suddenly ignited.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Because that ignition, it fundamentally alters the gravitational math.
Yeah.
Planets are being pulled in multiple directions at once, orbits are decaying.
Yeah.
And, the old astronomical charts that guided foreign policy and global trade for decades, they're now effectively useless.
Yeah.
We are witnessing arguably the most significant structural shift in international relations since the end of the Second World War.
And that is exactly why we're here. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to cut through that confusing, chaotic daily news cycle and explain this massive tectonic shift to you. We're talking about the transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar or perhaps a multi-order world.
And to do this, we are unpacking a remarkably dense stack of international relations theory and security data.
Yeah, we really brought the heavy reading today.
We did. We're going through John J. Mearsheimer's analysis on the rise and fall of the liberal international order. We're diving into the Munich Security Report 2025 and exploring future defense scenarios mapped out by the Italian Ministry of Defense.
And we aren't just looking at the military side?
No, not at all. We are combining those security frameworks with economic data from SEBRI, the Elcano Global Presence Index, and we're looking at critical minerals supply chain tracking from SEPRI. That's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Because you really can't separate the two anymore. Military strategy and global economics are just completely tangled up.
Exactly. In this new era, they are one and the same.
So, for decades, the global board game seemed to have one undisputed champion writing all the rules. But now, new players have amassed the wealth, the technological infrastructure, and just the sheer power to demand a completely new rulebook.
Which causes incredible friction.
Right. And we are going to explore the underlying mechanics of how we arrived at this fractured state, the massive contradictions inherent in today's global rivalries, and ultimately what this new world order means for the reality of your daily life.
Because, this isn't just academic theory happening in, embassy backrooms.
No, this shift dictates the cost of the electric vehicle you want to buy. It changes the data privacy laws governing your business, and it drives the inflation rate impacting your savings.
To understand the friction of this transition, though, we first have to understand the specific architecture of the system that is currently fracturing. We have to examine the baseline.
So we need to go back in time a bit.
Right. That takes us back to the early 1990s, to what foreign policy analysts call the unipolar moment.
Okay, picture this. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991, the Berlin Wall is already gone, and the Cold War ends not with, a nuclear exchange, but with an economic and ideological whimper from the East.
The United States is suddenly left standing in an empty boxing ring.
Completely empty. There are no peer competitors. And I think we often forget, or maybe we just take for granted, just how absolute that unipolarity really was.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just that the U.S. had the biggest military. It was this pervasive belief that the ideological debate of human history was permanently settled.
Yeah, we figured it all out.
Exactly. Francis Fukuyama encapsulated that perfectly with his famous thesis on the end of history.
Right, but he wasn't saying stuff would just stop happening, right?
No. He wasn't suggesting that geopolitical events would cease. He was arguing that humanity had reached the absolute endpoint of its ideological evolution.
That liberal democracy, married to a free market capitalist economy, was the final, optimal form of human governance.
Yes. The consensus was that all alternative systems, fascism, communism, absolute monarchy, had been tested and destroyed or discredited.
So the implication was that it was only a matter of time and, maybe some economic integration before every nation on Earth naturally converged on that exact same model.
It was an era of supreme institutional optimism.
And because the U.S. had no rival to check its power, it used that unipolar latitude to really build out the liberal international order. I mean, they poured immense political capital into expanding NATO, bolstering the UN, expanding the IMF, and ultimately, architecting the World Trade Organization.
And the prevailing logic was almost mathematical. If you spread free markets and integrate economies globally, well, political harmony will naturally output from the equation.
It sounds so simple when you put it like that.
It does. But the fatal flaw in that logic, as Mearsheimer and the CEBRI analysts point out, is that the system contained the exact mechanisms for its own dismantling.
Wow. Wait, so it broke itself?
Yeah. Unipolarity wasn't defeated by an external conqueror. It eroded from within, primarily through two specific avenues. And the first was the economic reality of hyperglobalization.
Okay, let's spend some time on the mechanics of that, because the narrative around globalization in the news is often, like, overly simplified.
Very much so.
The goal of hyperglobalization was the aggressive elimination of trade barriers, right?
Mm-hmm.
The frictionless movement of capital and the distribution of supply chains to wherever labor was cheapest.
I have the playbook, yes.
But wait, didn't globalization lift millions out of poverty? I mean, if we look at the raw data, it was a staggering success in terms of absolute global wealth.
Oh, without a doubt.
It created a massive new global middle class, primarily in Asia. The developing world experienced unprecedented growth. So it sounds like you're saying the system worked almost too well for the rest of the world, and that's what broke the American monopoly.
Well, let's connect the dots here. The CE/BRI report does not dispute the aggregate wealth creation. The vulnerability lay in what economists term uneven distributional costs.
Okay, what does that actually mean?
It means the aggregate data masked severe, localized economic devastation within the very Western nations that engineered the system in the first place.
Ah, I see. Which is the polite academic way of saying that while a multinational tech company saw its valuation explode and we got access to incredibly cheap consumer goods, the manufacturing base of places like the American Midwest or Northern England was completely hollowed out.
Exactly. The benefits of hyperglobalization were broad and diffuse. You save $50 on a television. But the costs were agonizingly concentrated.
Right. Entire communities lost their primary economic engines. A factory moving overseas didn't just mean job losses. It meant the collapse of the local tax base.
The defunding of schools, a severe spike in social crises, the list goes on.
And that intense concentration of economic loss fractured the domestic political consensus required to maintain the liberal order.
That's the key. When working-class populations in Western democracies realized that the international system was designed to prioritize global capital efficiency over their own domestic economic security, well, it fueled a massive populist backlash.
So the skepticism toward globalism, the rejection of international trade pacts, the protectionist rhetoric we hear from politicians today, that's all a direct downstream effect of those uneven distributional costs.
Exactly. The anchor of the unipolar system began rusting from the inside out.
And while the economic consensus was fracturing domestically, the geopolitical capital of the unipolar power was being completely squandered abroad.
Yes, which leads us to the second avenue of decline, and Mearsheimer outlines this with devastating clarity.
What does he say?
He argues that when a unipole lacks a rival great power to keep it in check, it loses its strategic discipline. It becomes free to engage in massive social engineering on a global scale.
Right, because during the Cold War, the U.S. was highly constrained.
Right, by the necessity of balance of power politics. Every intervention had to be weighed against the potential reaction of the Soviet Union.
The structural environment basically forced a pragmatic, realist approach.
But in a unipolar world, those constraints just evaporate. Mearsheimer points out that the U.S. fought 7 different wars in the post-Cold War era.
7 wars?
Yes. It transitioned from defending its vital strategic interests to embarking on ideological crusades, attempting to export liberal democracy to regions with entirely different historical and cultural architectures, and often doing it through military force.
Like the nation-building efforts in the Middle East and Central Asia.
Precisely.
I mean, the sheer cost of those endeavors is difficult to even comprehend. We are talking about trillions of dollars expended. A military apparatus exhausted by decades of counterinsurgency warfare, and a severe erosion of moral legitimacy on the global stage.
The U.S. was burning its unipolar fuel at an unsustainable rate, trying to reshape the world in its own image and largely failing to produce stable democracies in those regions.
Which culminates in this profound historical irony, right? While the United States was draining its resources on ideological conflicts, it was simultaneously utilizing hyperglobalization to actively fund the rise of its own future great power rivals.
It's incredible to look back on. The most consequential geopolitical gamble of the last 50 years was the decision to integrate China into the World Trade Organization in 2001.
The Clinton-era assumption there was incredibly transparent. The thought was, if we bring China into the WTO, if we entangle them in our supply chains and flood them with foreign investment, they will inevitably liberalize.
Right. The theory was that a growing middle class demands political representation. So economic freedom would act as like a Trojan horse for democratic reform.
But it was a fundamental misreading of international relations theory. The architects of the liberal order assumed that absolute economic gains, this idea that everybody is getting richer together, would somehow override the instinct for geopolitical competition.
They failed to foresee that economic interdependence does not eliminate great power rivalry. Instead, it merely accelerates the redistribution of power.
Wow.
Beijing brilliantly utilized its WTO integration to build an unparalleled manufacturing and export juggernaut. They capture the world's supply chains without ever compromising their domestic authoritarian political structure.
So if we go back to the analogy, the single sun in our geopolitical solar system is burning out its core through forever wars and domestic polarization,
Yes.
while simultaneously radiating massive amounts of wealth and technology toward a planet that is slowly accumulating enough mass to ignite into a second sun.
That's exactly what happened.
Let's shift our focus to the mechanics of how these rival poles actually emerged, because, it wasn't just a passive accumulation of wealth.
No, definitely not passive. The scale and velocity of China's rise are historically unprecedented.
Give us the numbers on that.
Well, following the initiation of economic reforms in 1978, China sustained an average annual GDP growth rate of roughly 9.4% for decades.
9.4%
Annually.
for decades.
Yes. They transitioned from an impoverished agrarian society to the factory of the world. And now, they are rapidly ascending to the position of an advanced technological superpower. But what the Munich Security Report emphasizes is the strategic intentionality behind this growth.
Right. It wasn't purely market forces. It was highly orchestrated state capitalism. You look at initiatives like Made in China 2025.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
That wasn't just a vague economic goal. It was a granular, state-subsidized master plan to systematically dominate global markets in 10 high-tech sectors. We're talking artificial intelligence, robotics, aerospace, green energy tech.
The state directed massive capital to national champions, and they often required foreign companies to transfer their proprietary technology as basically the cost of entry for accessing the Chinese consumer market.
And furthermore, they leveraged their newly accumulated capital to execute the Belt and Road Initiative, which is arguably the most ambitious geostrategic infrastructure project in modern history.
By financing and constructing ports, railways, highways, and telecommunication networks across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe, China essentially mapped a new architecture for global trade.
With Beijing right at the center.
Exactly. They created physical and digital dependency.
Right, like a developing nation gets a shiny new deep water port, but they also get massive debt owed to Chinese state banks. And suddenly their telecom infrastructure is running on hardware from Shenzhen.
It's a brilliant translation of economic wealth into hard geopolitical leverage.
And for decades, China operated as a rule taker, right? Playing quietly by the rules of the American-led system to accrue wealth without drawing fire.
Deng Xiaoping's old strategy: hide your strength, bide your time.
But now, with initiatives like Belt and Road and its assertive posture in the South China Sea, it has clearly transitioned into a rulemaker. It possesses the gravitational pull to establish its own norms and institutions.
So China represents the true peer competitor, the second sun. But the Italian Ministry of Defense scenarios remind us that the sky is far more complex than just a simple binary system.
Right, there's more out there.
We have to examine the resurgence of Russia, which operates as an entirely different type of pole.
Russia is such a fascinating variable because it doesn't fit the traditional economic profile of a superpower. I mean, its GDP is roughly comparable to that of Italy or Texas, right?
Yes, and it's heavily dependent on commodity exports, rather than a diversified, high-tech manufacturing base.
Yet, it projects power and disruption on a scale vastly disproportionate to its economic footprint.
Following the devastating economic and social collapse of the 1990s, Vladimir Putin centralized state control and utilized massive oil and gas revenues to stabilize the country and modernize its military apparatus.
But they knew they couldn't compete economically.
Right. Russia recognized that it could not outcompete the U.S. or China symmetrically in the economic sphere. Instead, as the Italian Mod outlines, Russia adopted the role of a revisionist power.
Meaning what, exactly?
Its strategic objective is not necessarily to replace the U.S. as the architect of a new global order, but to aggressively wear down and fracture the existing order to reclaim its historical spheres of influence.
They are the ultimate spoiler in the system, and they achieve this through the mastery of asymmetric and hybrid warfare.
Yes. They utilize private military companies to secure influence and resources in Africa and the Middle East, maintaining, plausible deniability.
And they deploy state-sponsored cyber operations to disrupt Western infrastructure. And let's not forget the sophisticated disinformation campaigns to amplify existing political polarization within democratic adversaries.
They proved that you don't need to match an opponent's GDP to paralyze their political system.
And the European reliance on Russian energy prior to 2022 was another textbook example of weaponized dependency, wasn't it?
Oh, perfectly executed.
Yeah.
Russia integrated itself just enough into the European energy grid to ensure that any geopolitical pushback against its territorial ambitions would carry a devastating economic cost for the West.
So they function as a localized, highly volatile gravitational anomaly in our multipolar solar system.
Exactly. And beyond the major revisionist powers, the Elcano Global Presence Index data points to perhaps the most complex and fluid dynamic of this whole transition.
You're talking about the rise of the global south and the middle powers.
Yes. We are looking at a fundamentally different posture from nations that previously operated on the periphery of great power politics. The expansion of the BRICS coalition is the structural manifestation of this shift.
BRICS. So originally that was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But recently they integrated Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates.
And this expanded coalition now accounts for approximately 40% of global trade, and a staggering 40% of global crude oil production.
What I find so critical about the analysis of these nations, particularly the hedging middle, like India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia, is their explicit rejection of a new Cold War binary.
Yes, they want no part of it.
During the 20th century, you were largely forced to align with either Washington or Moscow. Today, these swing states are looking at the escalating rivalry between the U.S. and China and flatly refusing to pick a permanent side.
Their diplomacy is fiercely transactional and issue-specific.
Give us an example.
Well, take India, for example. They are a vital member of the Quad security dialogue with the U.S., Japan, and Australia, which is designed to counter Chinese maritime expansion.
Okay.
Yet simultaneously, India vastly increases its purchases of discounted Russian oil, undermining Western sanctions, and maintains deep economic ties with Beijing.
So they are maximizing their strategic autonomy. They will buy American jet fighters, Chinese solar panels, and Russian energy, basically ruthlessly playing the major powers against each other to extract the best possible terms for their own national development.
Exactly. They don't want to dismantle the international system, but they want to decentralize it. So they are no longer subject to the unilateral dictates of Western financial institutions.
But, this brings up a critical structural question. We are observing the undeniable economic and diplomatic fragmentation of the world. But I can anticipate the skepticism from someone looking strictly at the military data we pulled from CPRI.
Yes, let's address that. Because the narrative of multipolarity hits a massive speed bump when you look at defense expenditures.
Right. If you look at the numbers, the United States still accounts for roughly 40% of total global military spending.
It's massive.
It maintains over 120 military bases worldwide, controls 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups, and possesses unmatched logistical capability to project overwhelming force anywhere on the planet within hours.
The hard military assets still look overwhelmingly unipolar.
So if that's the case, are we really multipolar yet? How did the sources reconcile that data with the premise of multipolarity?
It is a vital distinction and honestly a major point of debate among security analysts. The Munich Security Report addresses this by defining multipolarization not as a binary switch that has already been flipped, but as an accelerating trend.
Okay, so it's a process.
Yes. You do not need to match the United States dollar for dollar in aircraft carriers to function as a pole in the modern era.
Because the nature of power projection has changed.
Precisely. To be a pole, a state simply needs concentrated power in specific critical domains, whether that is regional military denial, critical technology supply chains, or raw economic gravity.
Just enough to deter the U.S.
Enough to successfully deter American objectives, project independent influence, and attract a bloc of aligned nations.
So like China's development of hypersonic missiles and anti-access area denial weapons in the South China Sea, that's designed to make American naval superiority in that specific region totally irrelevant.
Right, exactly. You don't need a global blue water navy if you can sink the adversary's ships from your own coastline.
Wow, yeah.
And look at the European Union. They operate as a regulatory pole. Their data privacy and market access laws force global corporations, including American tech giants, to alter their worldwide operations.
So the U.S. sun remains the brightest, but it no longer possesses the mass to control the orbits of these other immense bodies.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that structural reality, the shift in gravitational power, is what guarantees that these massive bodies are going to start crashing into each other. I mean, the system is no longer anchored by one undisputed power. The friction between the competing poles becomes the defining characteristic of the era.
Yes, and the primary battlefield for this friction, surprisingly, is not the South China Sea or the Suwalki Gap in Europe.
What is it?
The primary battlefield is geoeconomics.
See, let's break that down. We need to return to the concept of globalization to understand why.
Right. During the unipolar era, the global economy operated under the theory of absolute gains.
Meaning everyone wins.
The psychological framework was cooperative. If my nation engages in free trade with your nation, I might grow my economy by 5%, and you might grow yours by 10%. You captured a larger share of the new wealth, but my baseline still improved.
Therefore, the trade is logical and beneficial. A rising tide lifts all boats.
But the moment you introduce great power competition, that psychology violently shifts.
To a fixation on relative gains.
Exactly. Suddenly, the calculus is deeply paranoid. The mindset becomes, I don't care if this trade deal makes my economy 5% richer. I am terrified that you are getting 10% richer because you are a geopolitical rival.
Right. You might use that extra 5% of wealth to invest in quantum computing or hypersonic glide vehicles that you will eventually point at my cities.
The focus shifts entirely from maximizing total wealth to minimizing your adversary's relative advantage. And when that psychological shift occurs within a deeply integrated global economy, well, the integration itself becomes a weapon.
Weaponized interdependence. I was actually trying to find an analogy for this because it's a counterintuitive concept. We used to think that countries that traded together would never fight together.
The Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention.
Right. But the reality today is more like, imagine two people who harbor deep existential hatred for one another, but they are both forced to wear the exact same giant multi-person sweater.
Okay, I can picture that.
They want to destroy each other, but they are trying to have a fist fight inside this shared garment. You literally cannot throw a punch at the other person without violently pulling the fabric against your own neck, restricting your own arms, or tearing the clothes off your own back.
That analogy captures the agonizing constraint of the current system perfectly. Because our economies are so deeply fused, our supply chains, our financial clearinghouses, our intellectual property networks, any aggressive action inflicts severe self-damage.
Which is exactly why tariffs, export controls, and massive economic sanctions have replaced traditional military mobilization as the first resort of statecraft.
Nations are frantically mapping the intricate threads of the global supply chain, searching for choke points.
They're asking, where do we hold a monopoly on a critical component? And how can we squeeze the adversary's access to it without totally asphyxiating our own industries in the process?
And this geoeconomic warfare is most intense in the realm of emerging and disruptive technologies, or EDTs. The sources emphasize that the race for supremacy in artificial intelligence, 5G and 6G telecommunications networks, advanced semiconductors, and quantum computing is viewed as a zero-sum existential struggle.
Right. Whoever controls the foundational architecture of these technologies will dictate the operating system of the 21st century global economy.
And by extension, they dictate the future of military supremacy.
Because an autonomous drone swarm or a cyber warfare division relies entirely on access to advanced microchips.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the most alarming data in the SciPri report. The vulnerability of the physical supply chains that power these digital technologies, specifically the race for critical minerals.
This is a huge bottleneck. The transition away from fossil fuels toward green energy, so electric vehicles, massive battery storage, solar arrays, alongside the demand for advanced military hardware, requires an astronomical volume of specific elements.
Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth metals.
Yes. And the SciPri data illustrates just how terrifying this bottleneck is. It's not just about who mines the minerals out of the ground. It's about who refines them into usable industrial inputs.
And China has spent the last 2 decades strategically monopolizing the processing capacity for these critical minerals, right?
They have. They process roughly 60% to 90% of the global supply of various rare earth elements.
The strategic implication there is just stark. Western nations suddenly realize that in the event of a severe diplomatic crisis or, an open conflict over Taiwan, Beijing could theoretically embargo the export of refined rare earths.
They could instantly paralyze the Western production lines for both electric vehicles and F-35 fighter jets.
Which triggered the absolute panic we are seeing in Western capitals regarding de-risking and decoupling.
Governments are mandating and heavily subsidizing the relocation of critical supply chains out of rival territories and back to allied nations. Friendshoring.
Even when it is vastly more expensive and economically inefficient, purely to mitigate those national security vulnerabilities.
But the impossibility of completely severing these economic ties without triggering a global depression forces the major powers into a state of permanent, low-intensity conflict.
Because conventional warfare between nuclear-armed, economically intertwined states guarantees mutual destruction. So the battlefield shifts entirely to the shadows.
Returning to your sweater analogy, if you realize you can't throw a full knockout punch without breaking your own ribs, you resort to entirely different tactics.
You step on their toes, you pinch them, you quietly try to unravel the threads on their side of the garment.
Yes, and this is the definition of the hybrid threat landscape. Hybrid warfare utilizes instruments of power designed to inflict maximum strategic damage while deliberately remaining below the threshold that would trigger a conventional military response, like invoking NATO's Article 5.
Like state-sponsored hacking collectives infiltrating a rival's power grid or healthcare system to demonstrate vulnerability.
Or the theft of billions of dollars in proprietary aerospace research.
Or the weaponization of social media algorithms to flood an adversary's domestic population with disinformation, right? Exacerbating racial, economic, or political divides to paralyze their legislative process.
The goal isn't to conquer territory. The goal is to rot the adversary's society from the inside out so they cannot project power externally.
And overlaying all of this technological and economic friction is a profound ideological clash. The Seabright paper and the Italian Mahdi scenarios focus heavily on the structural friction between liberal democracies and authoritarian systems.
What is frequently branded as the global West versus the global East.
Yeah.
And analyzing this from a strictly structural perspective, devoid of moral judgment on the systems themselves, the Italian Mahdi highlights a significant tactical asymmetry.
Okay, lay that out for us. Remember, we're just analyzing the mechanics here.
Of course. Authoritarian regimes operate without the burden of democratic constraints. They do not face independent judicial oversight, an adversarial press, or regular, unpredictable election cycles.
Which means they can engage in ultra-long-term strategic planning.
Yes. A system like China's can conceptualize a 20-year global infrastructure project like the Belt and Road, allocate hundreds of billions of dollars to it, and execute it methodically.
Because they don't have to worry about a midterm election wiping out their parliamentary majority or a new populist president coming into office 4 years later, declaring the project a disaster and completely reversing the nation's foreign policy.
Meanwhile, Western liberal democracies are currently experiencing intense internal volatility. We are witnessing the resurgence of America First nationalism in the U.S., alongside robust populist Eurosceptic movements across the European continent.
And these movements represent a profound domestic skepticism toward international institutions, free trade agreements, and foreign military entanglements.
So at the exact moment the liberal international order is facing its most coordinated, well-resourced external challenge from centralized authoritarian powers, the domestic consensus within the West regarding how or even if they should maintain that order is fundamentally fracturing.
Which creates immense systemic unpredictability. If an allied nation isn't sure whether the United States will honor a security guarantee after the next election cycle, they are basically forced to hedge their bets and accommodate the rival poles.
This complex web of dependencies, hostilities, and internal fractures leads us to the massive contradictions of the new architecture. We are transitioning into a system that really defies historical comparison.
It really does, especially when you contrast it with the Cold War, which is honestly the lazy analogy everyone reaches for.
It is overused.
Because during the Cold War, the global system was cleanly bifurcated. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an existential security competition, but their economies were hermetically sealed from one another.
They operated in completely distinct silos.
If the Soviet agricultural sector collapsed or their industrial output plummeted, the U.S. stock market didn't register a blip. The security friction was isolated from the global economy.
But today, the reality is the exact inverse. The integration is absolute. And this generates the great paradox of the multipolar era.
What's the great paradox?
Washington and Beijing view each other with intense, escalating strategic distrust. They are modernizing their nuclear arsenals and actively preparing for the possibility of kinetic warfare in the Indo-Pacific.
Yet, simultaneously, they remain each other's indispensable economic partners. They exchange billions of dollars in goods, services, and student visas every single day.
The U.S. Treasury relies on foreign holdings of its debt, and Chinese manufacturing relies on Western consumer demand.
Furthermore, they are structurally forced to cooperate on planetary-scale existential threats. I mean, you cannot manage global climate change, regulate the proliferation of artificial intelligence, or prevent the next pandemic without deep, continuous coordination between the U.S. and China.
They are forced to be enemies, fierce economic competitors, and vital collaborative partners at the exact same moment.
The cognitive dissonance required to manage a foreign policy under these conditions is staggering.
Which is why Mearsheimer theorizes that to manage this impossible paradox, the global architecture will inevitably restructure into what he calls bounded orders.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of a bounded order, because this seems like the most probable structural outcome from our sources.
Mearsheimer argues that the world cannot sustain a fully integrated liberal order when the major powers view integration as a security threat. However, they also cannot afford a complete Cold War-style decoupling.
So what's the compromise?
The compromise is the emergence of bounded orders, essentially, highly distinct, competing geopolitical and economic blocs led by the major poles. You will likely see a U.S.-led bounded order and a Chinese-led bounded order.
Think of them as massive, exclusive clubs for the listener. Within your bounded order, you have shared technological standards, highly integrated and secured supply chains, aligned data privacy regimes, and mutual defense pacts.
Exactly. You trade freely within the club because you trust the other members not to weaponize the interdependence.
So the bounded orders are ideologically and economically siloed from one another.
Yes. However, and this is the crucial distinction from the Cold War, sitting above these exclusive blocs will be a thinner, overarching framework. Mearsheimer calls this the realist-based international order.
So there's a roof over the two separate houses.
Yes. But this overarching order is stripped of any ideological ambition. It makes no attempt to spread democracy, enforce human rights, or integrate domestic economies.
Its sole purpose is pragmatic survival.
It exists to manage the basic, unavoidable intercourse between the hostile bounded orders, facilitating essential arms control treaties to prevent nuclear annihilation, coordinating basic global shipping lanes, and providing a forum for climate negotiations.
It is a minimalist architecture of survival, but this transition into bounded orders put certain regions in an incredibly precarious position, most notably Europe.
Europe's dilemma is acute.
Historically, Europe has been the bedrock of the American-led liberal order, but the Elcano and Seabright analyses highlight that Europe is agonizing over this shift.
Because their entire economic model, particularly the German industrial engine, is deeply dependent on exports to the Chinese market and the import of cheap global manufacturing inputs.
However, their physical security relies almost entirely on the United States through the NATO alliance.
Right. As Washington aggressively pressures its allies to decouple from Beijing and align with the American bounded order, Europe fears being economically collateralized.
In response, the European Union has aggressively promoted the doctrine of open strategic autonomy, which, at first glance, the phrase feels like a political oxymoron. How can you be entirely open to the global market while remaining strategically autonomous from it?
It is an incredibly delicate regulatory tightrope. The EU is attempting to remain open to global trade and deeply committed to multilateral institutions like the WTO because their prosperity demands it.
But they realize they must aggressively develop defensive mechanisms.
They are implementing carbon border adjustment taxes, anti-coercion trade instruments, and stringent state subsidy investigations to protect their domestic industries from being hollowed out by cheap, state-backed Chinese imports.
Simultaneously, they are attempting to build enough sovereign technological capacity to avoid being completely crippled if a future U.S. administration decides to enact blanket global tariffs or withdraws its security umbrella entirely.
They're trying to fortify their island without burning the bridges to the mainland.
The sheer complexity of these macro-level shifts, bounded order, strategic autonomy, weaponized supply chains, can feel really abstract. But the friction of this transition is going to cascade down to the micro level.
It'll impact everyone.
I want to ground this in the reality of the listener. If you are listening to this right now and you're a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, a tech startup founder, or just a consumer trying to buy a new smartphone, how does the fracturing of the global order actively alter your daily life?
The transition from an economic model optimized for efficiency to one optimized for security carries a massive, unavoidable price tag.
Right.
The era of relentless deflationary pressure, where consumer goods magically became cheaper every year because production was constantly shifting to the lowest wage environments, that era is effectively over.
You are going to feel it fundamentally in your wallet. When a multinational corporation is pressured by national security mandates to abandon a highly efficient multi-billion-dollar manufacturing hub in Asia and rebuild that identical infrastructure in Ohio or Arizona, the capital expenditure is staggering.
And those costs, the friction of de-risking, and the impact of retaliatory tariffs are passed directly to the consumer. Persistent, structurally driven inflation in the technology and green energy sectors will be a defining feature of the bounded order economy.
You will also experience severe technological fragmentation, often referred to as the splinter net.
We are moving toward a reality where the foundational infrastructure of the digital world bifurcates. A smartphone engineered for the Chinese bounded order may operate on entirely different telecommunication standards, utilize incompatible microprocessors, and connect to an entirely separate internet ecosystem walled off by sovereign firewalls, compared to a device built for the American order.
So if you run a software company, the dream of writing one application and deploying it to a seamless global market is dead. You will have to navigate wildly conflicting data localization laws. AWS might have to physically silo European data, American data, and Asian data, complying with entirely different privacy and security regimes.
Multiplying your compliance costs exponentially.
And perhaps, most fundamentally, you will witness the aggressive return of state intervention in the economy.
The neoliberal consensus of the past 40 years demanded that governments step back and let the free market dictate the allocation of capital. That era has ended.
Governments are embracing muscular industrial policy again. They will deploy massive subsidies to prop up national champions in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and semiconductor manufacturing.
They will aggressively block foreign acquisitions of local companies on the grounds of national security. The demarcation line between private enterprise and state security will become virtually indistinguishable.
So if the unipolar system is dead, and we are currently suffering through the agonizing friction of this multipolar transition, the ultimate question is, where does this trajectory lead?
We have some models for that. The Bertelsmann Stiftung and the Italian Ministry of Defense provided fascinating, granular scenarios mapping out the potential geopolitical landscape of 2035 and 2040.
Let's examine three distinct, structurally possible futures.
The first scenario is frequently characterized as the five-body problem, representing a return to a strict, rigid system of spheres of influence.
It sounds like the title of a hard sci-fi novel, but the mechanics are deeply historical. In this scenario, the global system formalizes its fragmentation.
The major powers, the United States, China, Russia, India, and an increasingly autonomous European Union, carved the globe into exclusive, recognized spheres.
Each pole operates as the undisputed hegemon within its defined regional neighborhood. They exert total economic and security dominance over their immediate periphery.
The stability of the system relies on a fragile 19th century-style balance of power. The major poles might even form an exclusive concert of powers, a localized council to manage global crises.
It's essentially a geopolitical mafia commission. The U.S. says, we control the Western Hemisphere unconditionally. China takes East Asia, Russia claims Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
The fundamental rule of the system is that you do not cross the red lines into another pole's established territory.
Which prevents a catastrophic, civilization-ending global war because everyone respects the boundaries, but it guarantees endless, brutal proxy conflicts and low-level friction along the physical borders of those spheres.
And if you are a small nation caught in the borderland between two spheres, your sovereignty is effectively erased.
Wow. Okay, what's the second scenario?
The second scenario shifts the focus from geographic spheres to ideological pragmatism. Mearsheimer refers to this as the emergence of agnostic orders, or competitive coexistence.
In this reality, the major powers conduct a ruthless accounting of the past 4 decades. They look at the trillions of dollars incinerated and the political capital destroyed by ideological crusades.
The United States acknowledges the failure of armed democratic state building, and China calculates that attempting to force its authoritarian model on client states generates too much resistance and economic blowback.
So they reach a cynical but stabilizing consensus. Attempting to alter the domestic political architecture of rival nations is a strategic liability.
They adopt strictly agnostic foreign policies. The moral and ideological components of international relations are entirely stripped away.
The global order becomes a purely transactional bazaar. The U.S. stops leveraging human rights records in trade negotiations. China stops demanding ideological fealty from its economic partners.
They agree to fundamentally disagree on the nature of human governance. If a nation wishes to operate as a totalitarian dictatorship, that is their internal business. If another nation operates as a liberal democracy, fine.
As long as global shipping lanes remain open, sovereign debt is serviced, and nuclear weapons remain holstered, the overarching system ignores domestic atrocities. It is a highly stable, ruthlessly pragmatic, and profoundly morally vacant world order.
Which brings us to the third scenario, conceptualized by the British Academy and expanded upon in the Munich Security Report. This is the transition to a multi-order or multiplex world.
And this is the most complex, but arguably the most accurate trajectory of our current momentum.
I agree.
I am fascinated by the distinction between multipolar and multiplex. A multipolar world implies that there are several massive players, but they're all playing the exact same game, on the same board, fighting over the same rulebook.
But a multiplex world means different regions and different domains of power are governed by entirely different games with conflicting sets of rules operating simultaneously.
The architecture is no longer a single hierarchy.
In a multiplex world, the remnants of the Western liberal order continue to function, heavily focused on human rights and free markets. But it overlaps geographically and economically, with a Beijing-led techno-authoritarian order focused on state-directed development and digital surveillance.
And both of those might intersect with a Russian-led Eurasian security architecture.
The analogy that crystallized this for me is technological.
Oh, share that.
Imagine a world operating on different digital ecosystems. You have the iOS order in the West, highly curated, walled-off specific rules for entry. You have an Android order in the East. Different architecture, different hardware.
And maybe an open-source Linux order operating across the global south?
Right. None of these operating systems are inherently compatible, yet they are all forced to connect to the exact same global Wi-Fi network to manage climate change, pandemic response, and basic macroeconomic stability.
It is a glitchy, chaotic, overlapping mess of a system, but through sheer necessity, it functions.
And the defining feature of the multiplex world is the extreme fluidity of the non-aligned nations. The global south thrives in this environment.
Because there is no single dominant order, a nation like Brazil or Indonesia can fluidly shop across the different operating systems.
They might rely on the American financial order to float their sovereign debt, integrate Chinese 5G infrastructure to run their domestic telecommunications, and purchase Russian agricultural exports to feed their population.
They construct an entirely bespoke foreign policy, picking and choosing from the different menus offered by the major poles. But navigating that requires an exhausting level of diplomatic agility.
One misstep, one miscalculation of leverage, and you anger multiple poles simultaneously.
Survival in a multiplex reality demands constant hypervigilant balancing. You can never fully commit to a single block, and you can never fully alienate one.
Which perfectly explains why the middle powers today are so aggressively resisting the pressure from Washington and Beijing to pick a side. They are actively training for the multiplex reality.
Synthesizing the immense volume of theory and data we've covered today, the trajectory is undeniable. The comforting predictability of the unipolar era is a historical artifact.
The United States remains a massive center of gravity, but it is no longer the sole architect of the global system.
We traced how the hubris of the unipolar moment, the assumption that hyperglobalization and military intervention would inevitably produce a homogeneous liberal world, actually funded the rise of peer competitors and hollowed out the domestic consensus in the West.
We examined the explosive, state-directed rise of China as a true systemic rival, the resurgence of Russia as a master of asymmetric disruption, and the awakening of the Global South as an opportunistic, non-aligned bloc.
We analyzed the terrifying mechanics of weaponized interdependence, where the deep economic integration of the past 30 years has been transformed into a battlefield.
And the race to monopolize the critical minerals and emerging technologies that will dictate the future has triggered a massive inflationary wave of global de-risking and protectionism.
And we explored the structural paradox of superpowers forced to collaborate on planetary survival while simultaneously preparing for mutual destruction, leading us toward a future defined by exclusive bounded orders, pragmatic but morally agnostic coexistence, or a chaotic, overlapping multiplex reality.
It is an incredibly dense, overlapping matrix of risks and variables.
It is the defining analytical challenge of our time. Grasping these underlying structural forces, the shift from absolute to relative gains, the mechanics of hybrid warfare is the only way to decode the seemingly irrational events dominating the daily news cycle.
Exactly.
Before we conclude this deep dive, though, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative concept drawn from the margins of the Bertelsmann Stiftung scenarios. Everything we have analyzed today, every theory of multipolarity or bounded orders, fundamentally assumes that the primary actors, the poles determining the future of humanity, will be traditional nation-states.
It assumes the board is played by the U.S., China, the EU, and India.
But they outline a wildcard scenario they call beyond states.
It challenges the very definition of a superpower in the 21st century. What occurs when the rigid architecture of global governance continues to dissolve, and the vacuum is filled not by another nation, but by stateless entities?
We are approaching an era where massive multinational technology corporations, sovereign wealth funds, and individual tech billionaires possess more liquid capital, control more critical data infrastructure, and wield more direct influence over the daily lives of citizens than the actual sovereign governments attempting to regulate them.
We've already seen flashes of this reality, when a single tech CEO possesses the unilateral authority to alter the tactical battlefield of a European war simply by toggling access to a proprietary satellite internet constellation. The traditional definitions of geopolitical power begin to fail.
If an artificial intelligence corporation achieves artificial general intelligence holding the keys to the next massive leap in human industrial capacity, do they become a sovereign pole unto themselves?
Will the future of diplomacy involve the U.S. State Department negotiating treaties not just with Beijing or Brussels, but directly with tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley?
Are we transitioning from a chaotic world of rival superpowers to a dystopian reality of supercorporations dictating the rules of the multiplex? It is a staggering concept to mull over the next time you agree to the terms of service on your smartphone.
It fundamentally redefines the nature of sovereignty. The gravity in our system may not just be shifting to new planets, but to entirely new forms of matter.
An incredible paradigm shift to watch unfold. Thank you for taking the time to navigate this massive geopolitical architecture with us. The single sun of the 1990s has set. The new suns have ignited. The gravitational pulls are shifting beneath our feet, and the old maps will no longer guide us. Keep questioning the simplified narratives, pay attention to the underlying mechanics of power, and we will see you on the next deep dive.
If you freeze $300 billion of a sovereign nation's assets overnight, you don't just win a war, you accidentally teach the rest of the world how to build a financial system without you.
Yeah, exactly.
The submission we are reviewing today provides a deep geopolitical analysis of the shifting global power dynamics, exploring BRICS de-dollarization, the push for IMF reform, and the European Union's pursuit of open strategic autonomy. Let's dive straight into the critique.
Right, let's get into it.
So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the fracturing of Western hegemony.
Yes, absolutely. It's everywhere in the text.
But, reading this material feels a bit like watching individual chess pieces moving across the board without fully understanding the overarching strategy of the players moving them.
I completely agree. The submitted materials provide an incredibly thorough geopolitical analysis, yet the overarching narrative connecting these regional perspectives remains somewhat fragmented.
Fragmented, yeah, that's a really good word for it, because they cover so much ground.
They really do. But the specific weakness here is that the text jumps rapidly between BRICS' efforts to create alternative payment systems, and then it goes right into the EU's internal struggles with Commission accountability.
Right.
And then suddenly we're looking at the IMF's controversial $57 billion loan to Argentina under Mauricio Macri.
Yeah, it's a bit dizzying.
It is. And they do all this without explicitly tying these distinct events into a single unified thesis. You just get whiplash going from one region to the next.
Right. It reads almost like a really sophisticated table of contents,
Exactly.
So what is the suggestion here? How do they actually fix that fragmentation?
Well, my suggestion would be to create a central connective tissue that explicitly links these regional actions as reactive symptoms of a single global phenomenon.
Okay, and what is that phenomenon?
Specifically, the weaponization of economic interdependence.
Ah, the weaponization of economic interdependence. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right? Because if you look at the concrete examples in the text, you can see it hiding in plain sight. For instance, the author should connect the EU's new anti-coercion instrument directly to the exact same US-driven pressures that are motivating BRICS.
You mean the freezing of those Russian foreign exchange reserves?
Yes! That $300 billion freeze, that is the catalyst. That's what is pushing BRICS to explore commodity-backed settlements, right?
Right, because they are terrified of being next.
Exactly. And the author needs to show how that exact same pressure is making the EU panic and build this anti-coercion instrument. They are all reacting to the same thing.
Yeah, I see what you mean. The EU isn't just tweaking trade policy in a vacuum.
No, not at all. And another great concrete example would be the Dragon Bear Alliance.
Right, the China and Russia coordination.
Yes, the author mentions it, but they need to show how that alliance directly necessitates the EU's shift away from a purely multilateral reliance.
Meaning they have to move toward unilateral trade enforcement?
Right, because China and Russia are actively proving that supply chains can be weaponized. So the EU basically has no choice but to arm itself.
Right, which creates a really natural transition, because if economic interdependence is literally being weaponized out in the open, it makes sense that we have to look closely at the internal rule changes these institutions are making to arm themselves.
Absolutely. They have to rewrite their own rule books to survive.
Exactly. So let's look closely at the section discussing the EU's procedural shifts. Because honestly, reading this part feels a bit like reading the technical manual for a submarine when what the reader really wants to know is if it can survive a depth charge.
That is such a perfect way to put it. Because the topic sentence for this next critique would be, the granular exploration of institutional bureaucracy is highly accurate but occasionally buries the profound geopolitical stakes beneath procedural mechanics.
Yeah, it gets so into the weeds.
It really does. The weakness is that the manuscript spends significant time detailing these comitology procedures.
Oh man, the comitology section.
Right. Specifically, it goes super deep into the difference between advisory and examination procedures in the EU's foreign subsidies regulation.
Right.
And then it does the same thing with the IMF's quota system. And the risk there is just entirely losing the audience's attention on the broader strategic implications.
Because you're basically reading administrative red tape at that point.
Exactly. You lose the forest for the trees. So my suggestion here is to elevate the strategic importance of these procedural rules. The author needs to frame them as critical battlegrounds for geopolitical survival rather than mere administrative plumbing.
So how would they do that practically? Give me a concrete example.
Okay, so instead of merely noting that the EU Commission avoids the examination procedure to limit member state control.
Because the examination procedure requires a vote, right?
Exactly. It requires a majority of member states to agree. So instead of just dryly stating that they use the advisory procedure to avoid that, the author should frame this as a deliberate, high-stakes sacrifice of democratic accountability.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right? It's a desperate bid to act with the speed necessary to counter Chinese state capitalism.
I mean, if you think about it, Beijing has heavily invested in certain European countries.
Yes, and if the Commission waits for a vote, one compromised country could veto the whole thing.
So they bypass the member states entirely just to survive? That is fascinating. When you frame it like that, it's not just a legal footnote. It's basically a constitutional crisis.
Precisely. And they need to use that exact same framing for the IMF section.
Right, the quota system.
Yeah. Right now, the text just talks about the IMF's outdated, Western-dominated quota system as this mathematical formula based on GDP and openness.
Which is super dry.
Right. But the author should link that procedural gridlock directly to the BRICS motivation for creating the new development bank in Shanghai.
Oh, I see, because the Global South couldn't get a fair vote at the IMF?
Exactly. Illustrate how procedural gridlock literally birthed a rival global institution. The math isn't just math, it is the catalyst that fractured the global financial order.
That makes so much sense. It really shows how the procedural choices being made today are dictating the global reality of tomorrow.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? I mean, regarding those future scenarios at the very end of the manuscript?
Oh, the 2035 projections?
Yeah.
Because I want to challenge the author here. Are these 2035 projections just sort of academic thought experiments, or can they actually be used as practical tools for immediate policy evaluation?
That is a great question, and it leads right into the final critique. The topic sentence here is, the future projections and scenarios presented are fascinating but currently exist in isolation from the concrete policy actions discussed in earlier sections.
They really do. They just sort of sit there at the end.
Right.
The weakness is that these 6 scenarios for 2035.
Like the five-body problem?
Yeah, and the America Great Again scenario.
Right.
They are presented as standalone concepts at the end of the text, and they are not explicitly tested against the current policy actions, like de-dollarization or the EU's new trade instruments.
So it feels a bit like an appendix that isn't really talking to the rest of the book.
Exactly. It's like a totally separate essay. So the suggestion is to integrate those 2035 scenarios throughout the text as analytical stress tests for the current policies being discussed.
Analytical stress tests? Okay, I like the sound of that.
Yeah, it basically turns them from a concluding appendix into an active analytical framework.
So instead of just reading about a policy, we actually throw it into the 2035 simulator to see what happens?
Exactly. Let me give you a concrete example. When the author is discussing Trump's potential 100% tariffs on de-dollarizing nations.
Which is a huge policy threat. Right. Instead of just describing it, the author should explicitly evaluate if this policy makes the bipolar two-man show scenario more likely.
Because a tariff like that would force fence-sitting nations like, India or Brazil
to pick a side.
Right. They can't play the middle anymore.
Exactly.
They have to choose between the U.S. and China. And if you force them to choose, you actively accelerate that bipolar two-man show reality.
That is such a powerful way to use the scenario. You're showing the unintended consequences of the policy in real time.
Right. And here is another concrete example. When analyzing the BRICS push for blockchain payments or a commodity-backed currency.
Right, moving off of SWIFT.
Yeah. The author needs to actively assess whether this technological shift accelerates the authoritarian international scenario.
Because if autocracies can trade on a blockchain, they bypass Western sanctions entirely.
Yes. And the author should ask, does this make the authoritarian international inevitable? Or does it simply entrench a bifurcated, multi-currency global order where things just cost a little more?
That is brilliant. It forces the reader to really engage with the so what of every single policy. It's not just a cool idea for the future, it's a tool to evaluate today.
Exactly. It makes the whole manuscript feel like a cohesive, forward-looking engine.
Well, this has been an incredibly productive breakdown. Let me quickly recap the 3 main actionable suggestions for the listener to take away.
Please do.
First, unify the regional narratives into a single thesis centered on the weaponization of economic interdependence.
Right.
Second, frame bureaucratic procedures, like the EU comitology and the IMF quotas, as high-stakes geopolitical battlegrounds.
Absolutely crucial.
And third, use those 2035 scenarios to actively stress test current policies rather than just leaving them as standalone concepts at the back of the book.
Yeah, those changes will make a massive difference. This was a really strong piece of writing, but with these adjustments, it'll be incredibly impactful. And we would warmly invite the listener to submit the revised work back in for another critique in the future. We would love to read it.
We definitely would. Thanks for joining us for this critique. Until next time, keep analyzing, keep refining, and we'll see you on the next one.
Welcome to The Debate. When we think about the global financial system, we usually picture it like the world's electrical grid.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So you plug an appliance into the wall, the power flows, and the machine works. It's highly standardized, invisible to the user, and, well, you're completely dependent on it to keep the lights on.
It's a foundational utility. You don't actually think about the wiring or the power stations until the entity controlling that grid decides to, pull the plug.
And suddenly, your house goes dark.
Right, and your food spoils.
Exactly. And over the last few years, several major economies have been sitting in the dark. They are realizing that this universal utility isn't just a convenience. It is a profoundly powerful mechanism of control.
A weapon, really.
Yeah, a weapon. So today, we are looking at the accelerating push by the BRICS Plus nations to actively de-dollarize the global economy.
And the core question we are debating is whether we are watching the genuine, imminent dismantling of the US dollar's global hegemony, or conversely, if BRICS Plus is just building a fragmented regional workaround that's ultimately going to collapse under its own structural barriers.
Right, because looking at the source material on the 2025 geopolitical landscape, I represent the side arguing that they are successfully laying the infrastructural foundation for a bifurcated multipolar order. The structural shift away from the US dollar is already an undeniable reality.
On the deep institutional gravity of the dollar and the severe internal divides within the BRICS Plus alliance itself, and I see these efforts as marginal hedges. They are building backup generators, sure, but they are not replacing the grid.
Well, if you look at the raw economic mass, BRICS Plus now represents 37% of global GDP when we measure by purchasing power parity. That means accounting for what money actually buys locally.
Right.
And they hold 45% of the global population.
Size is certainly a factor, but economic mass alone doesn't print a reserve currency.
True. But the real catalyst here isn't just their size, it's necessity. Following the weaponization of the dollar, most notably when the West froze $300 billion in Russian foreign exchange reserves, well, economic sovereignty suddenly became an existential requirement for the global South.
Right, they saw the electrical grid weaponized.
Exactly. And because of that, we are seeing tangible milestones. By late 2024, over 95% of bilateral trade between China and Russia was settled in local currencies.
Wow, 95%.
Yeah. And we are seeing the United Arab Emirates and India settling oil trades in rupees. This is a massive, permanent erosion of the unipolar financial order.
I understand the political will to de-dollarize is very real, and freezing those Russian reserves absolutely sent a shock wave through global capitals. But the structural and institutional mechanisms to actually replace the dollar simply do not exist within BRICS Plus.
Why do you say that?
My position is grounded in the hard numbers. The US dollar still accounts for roughly 58 to 60% of global central bank foreign exchange reserves. Conversely, look at external debt. BRICS Plus external liabilities represent just 6% of global external debt, compared to 21% for the US.
But why do you weigh the debt liability so heavily here?
Because you cannot have a global reserve currency without deep, highly liquid, and transparent capital markets to absorb that capital.
Ah, I see.
Right? The world uses the dollar because the U.S. Treasury market is a massive, secure sponge for global savings. If you want to dump the dollar, you need a safe place to park trillions of dollars. BRICS Plus does not have that.
Okay, but...
And furthermore, look at the internal imbalances. China accounts for 62% of the GDP of the 10 BRICS Plus nations. Smaller members, particularly India, are terrified of simply replacing American financial hegemony with Chinese financial dominance. Without a true lender of last resort, this de-dollarization is just a tactical workaround for sanctioned states.
But that assumes they are trying to build an exact replica of the U.S. system, which they aren't. They are proactively bypassing Western systems entirely. Take the New Development Bank, which is the multilateral lender for BRICS.
Right, the NDB.
Yes, they have actively shifted to issuing loans in local currencies. Let me explain why that mechanism is so crucial. If Brazil takes out a massive infrastructure loan denominated in U.S. dollars, and the U.S. Federal Reserve decides to hike interest rates to fight domestic inflation, Brazil's debt suddenly skyrockets through no fault of their own.
That is a fair point about the vulnerability.
Right. So by lending in local currencies, BRICS Plus severs that transmission line of U.S. monetary policy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Issuing a few loans in local currencies is great for optics, but plumbing is completely useless without a stable reservoir. You mentioned India and the UAE trading oil in rupees.
I did, yes.
And China and Russia trading in local currencies. Let's unpack the actual logistical headache of that. If Russia sells a massive amount of oil to India, and India pays in rupees, Russia suddenly ends up accumulating billions of rupees.
Which they can then use to buy Indian goods.
In theory, sure. But in reality, Russia struggles to spend them because India doesn't export the high-tech machinery or advanced microchips that Russia desperately needs.
Well, that's a temporary supply chain issue.
It's a fundamental structural issue. And because the rupee isn't fully convertible globally, Russia can't just take those rupees and spend them in Taiwan or Germany. They are stuck. You can build all the alternative payment messaging systems you want, like China SIPs or the proposed BRICS bridge. But if the currency flowing through those pipes isn't universally accepted or convertible, it's essentially just a modernized barter system.
That trade imbalance issue, the rupee trap for Russia, is real. But it is exactly why the bloc is aggressively exploring a multi-asset settlement mechanism. They aren't relying solely on fiat currency.
They're looking at commodities?
Exactly. They are looking at tying transactions to tangible assets. We're talking about food, energy, and rare earth metals. Keep in mind, BRICS Plus accounts for over 74% of the global deposits of rare earth elements.
That's a huge share, yes.
It's massive. They are looking at mechanisms similar to the IMF's special drawing rights, which is essentially a synthetic currency made up of a basket of different assets to average out volatility. When you tie trade to real-world commodities, you mitigate the speculative swings that plague fiat currencies.
But the mechanism for commodity backing is fundamentally constrained by the reality of their physical reserves. I mean, if you want a hard asset to back a settlement mechanism, gold is the primary substitute.
Right, and they've been buying a lot of it.
A feverish buying spree, yes. Yet despite that, gold constitutes only 10% of total BRICS Plus reserves. That is half the global average.
Really, half?
Half.
If BRICS Plus wanted to actually back a synthetic multi-asset basket reliably enough to facilitate global trade, they would need to double their gold holdings. That would create a surge in global demand that physical mining production simply cannot meet.
You're still viewing this through a traditional Bretton Woods lens, focusing on gold and sovereign debt. I think you are underestimating the sheer gravitational pull of the energy commodities they control.
How so?
Well, let's look at the 2025 expansion of the bloc. They brought Indonesia in as a full member, adding massive demographic and digital economy advantages. BRICS Plus already accounts for 37% of emerging market fuel trade.
The energy sector is definitely their stronghold.
Exactly. And if Saudi Arabia fully integrates, the bloc controls 42% of global oil. That matches the combined output of the US, Canada, and Mexico. When you control the physical fuel that the world requires to simply function, well, you eventually dictate the currency used to purchase it.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the profound fragility of this geopolitical alliance? You are painting BRICS Plus as this cohesive anti-Western vanguard. But internally, it is deeply fractured.
Fractured how? They seem pretty aligned on this issue?
If you are listening to this and wondering why India doesn't just adopt the Chinese yuan to bypass the dollar, you have to look at the Himalayas. India and China are fierce geopolitical rivals with active, deadly border disputes. India is incredibly cautious about ceding even an inch of financial sovereignty to a system where Beijing pulls the strings.
It is absolutely a diverse bloc with internal friction. I won't deny that. But the shared desire to insulate their domestic economies from the outsized impact of the Federal Reserve bridges those divides.
You think so?
Yes. They are united by a shared defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism that is incredibly vulnerable to geopolitical shifts. We have to factor in what analysts are calling the eagle-bear scenario.
Ah, you are referring to a potential U.S.-Russia rapprochement.
Exactly. The eagle representing Washington, the bear representing Moscow. Under the 2025 Trump administration, there is a very real possibility of the U.S. and Russia exploring overlapping interests in regional stabilization or arms control.
That would be a major shift.
Right, and that introduces massive strategic uncertainty into BRICS Plus. The core engine of BRICS Plus momentum right now is the Dragon Bear alignment, the Sino-Russian partnership.
Sure, Beijing and Moscow.
If Moscow suddenly finds geopolitical flexibility with the United States, that anti-Western core fractures. If Russia starts hedging its bets, the entire coherence of BRICS Plus as a unified counterweight evaporates. Smaller members would immediately face immense pressure to clarify their loyalties.
I actually see Washington's aggressive posture as the glue holding BRICS Plus together, regardless of temporary diplomatic shifts. The globalized nature of supply chains is precisely why these nations are desperate for an alternative.
Desperate, maybe. But is it feasible?
Yes, because when the U.S. weaponizes access to its markets and its currency, it leaves the Global South with no choice but to build a parallel system.
But the sheer economic cost of defying the U.S. makes full de-dollarization entirely too painful to execute. President Trump has explicitly threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS Plus members seeking to replace the dollar.
Which is a massive threat.
It is. We are already looking at aggressive measures like the 245% cumulative tariffs on China. Can a country like South Africa truly afford to be caught in this crossfire?
It would be tough for them.
They risk losing preferential trade agreements like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which provides duty-free access to U.S. markets. Economic retaliation from the West would shatter the fragile economies of the newer BRICS Plus members long before a new financial system could save them.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. That U.S. economic coercion isn't a deterrent. It is precisely the catalyst that makes de-dollarization inevitable. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
How is 100% tariff a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Because when Washington threatens 100% tariffs on sovereign nations simply for seeking financial autonomy, you aren't scaring them back into line. You are validating their deepest fears about dollar dependency. You are proving that the dollar is a weapon.
A weapon they still heavily rely on.
For now. But look at the parallel to the European Union's recent turn toward open strategic autonomy.
Okay, the EU.
The EU recognized that international trade was being politicized, so that they actively expanded their own trade enforcement regulations and anti-coercion instruments to protect their internal market from third-country weaponization.
Right, they built structural defenses.
Exactly. And BRICS Plus is doing the exact same thing on a monetary level. Extreme U.S. tariffs will only accelerate their adoption of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, and blockchain technology.
And how does a blockchain solve a tariff?
It bypasses the choke points. Right now, international dollar transfers rely on correspondent banks that clear through the U.S., making them subject to U.S. sanctions. By using decentralized digital ledgers, central banks can settle trades instantly, peer-to-peer, without touching a Western clearinghouse. When the dominant power threatens to lock the front door to the global economy, you don't surrender, you build a new door.
Let's use a different analogy here. Building a new door or a new operating system through CBDCs and blockchain is technologically fascinating. The dollar right now is like the universal operating system of global trade, like Windows or iOS.
Sure, standard OS.
You can write a new operating system using blockchain and call it BRICS OS. But to make it work, you have to convince thousands of independent app developers, the multinational corporations, to port their entire businesses over to an untested platform.
That's a big ask.
Exactly. And frankly, a platform where the lead developers, China and India, are actively fighting over the source code.
Well, multinational corporations are highly pragmatic. If the cost of doing business in dollars becomes too volatile due to U.S. sanctions and tariffs, they will port their business over.
But the macroeconomic realities don't support that leap. There was an absence of regulatory cohesion across BRICS Plus nations that severely hinders the scalability of these digital payments.
It's early days, though.
Sure, but furthermore, the U.S. financial system remains a powerful anchor because of its inherent strengths. The Federal Reserve's high interest rates have made U.S. dollar assets highly attractive to global investors. Emerging markets are heavily discouraged from diversifying their reserves too quickly because the yield on U.S. debt is so strong.
That yield is definitely a factor.
Right. You brought up the EU earlier. Even with their massive push for strategic autonomy, the euro has entirely failed to usurp the dollar globally. If the Eurozone, with decades of deep monetary integration, institutional cohesion, and shared legal frameworks, cannot unseat the dollar, how can a disjointed block of geopolitical rivals with vastly different economic models achieve it?
Because, again, they are not trying to replicate the euro. The goal isn't a single unified fiat currency managed by a central BRICS bank in Shanghai. That's old world thinking.
So what is the new thinking?
The goal is a decentralized, multinodal system. Trade is settled in local currencies, backstopped by physical commodities, and routed through digital ledgers. And we are seeing the speed of this transition.
Are we, though?
Yes. By August 2024, the share of local currencies in bilateral trade between China and Russia exceeded 95%. That is a staggering logistical shift in a very short amount of time. It proves that when the political will is aligned with the technological capability, the transition away from the dollar can happen rapidly.
rapidly between two highly sanctioned autocracies that are heavily aligned against the West. Scaling that bilateral emergency measure to democratic nations with incredibly deep Western ties, like Brazil or India, is a completely different geopolitical puzzle.
It's more complex, yes.
Much more complex. A weakened U.S. dollar introduces massive currency volatility and reshapes global commodity pricing in ways that are highly disruptive to developing economies. Without a unified regulatory framework, this BRICS Plus multi-asset settlement mechanism functions as a shadow economy.
A shadow economy?
Yeah. It's useful for sanctioned states to trade oil for industrial parts, sure, but it is deeply unappealing for transparent multinational corporations trying to navigate a fragmented global economy.
Well, multinational corporations are already rethinking their exposure to U.S. financial policies. The structural transition toward a multipolar financial system isn't a theoretical future. It is actively underway.
You really believe it's past the point of no return?
I do. Through the expansion of commodity-backed trade, the proliferation of local currency swaps that bypass U.S. interest rate volatility, and the rapid deployment of digital financial infrastructure, BRICS Plus is permanently eroding the unipolar financial order.
It's eroding, sure.
Right. It may not look like a traditional reserve currency takeover, but the absolute unquestioned supremacy of the U.S. dollar is definitively fracturing. The bloc is successfully building the tools to ensure that Washington can no longer unilaterally dictate the terms of global trade.
I will certainly concede that U.S. dollar dominance is facing legitimate, unprecedented friction, and that we are watching global trade fracture into a more bifurcated system. That is undeniable.
Good, we agree there.
However, the deep institutional gravity of the dollar, the unparalleled liquidity of the U.S. Treasury market, the transparency of Western capital, and the sheer safety of U.S. debt, coupled with the profound internal geopolitical rivalries within BRICS plus M, will prevent a complete global financial revolution.
So it stays regional.
Exactly. De-dollarization is going to remain a collection of fragmented, regional initiatives. It provides vital tactical relief for certain nations, absolutely, but it fundamentally lacks the structural foundation to build a scalable, cohesive financial architecture that can truly rival the existing system.
It is fascinating to see how our perspectives have evolved throughout this discussion. We both clearly agree that the weaponization of the dollar was the catalyst that changed the game.
Right.
And that global finance is actively bifurcating.
Yes, the unquestioned monopoly is over. We just fundamentally disagree on the ultimate scale and viability of what BRICS Plus is building to replace it.
Exactly. We are looking at a world that is heavily bound by the legacy of the Bretton Woods system, while simultaneously, half the globe is feverishly building the tools to dismantle it. There is far more nuance to explore in the geopolitical source material regarding the shift.
Absolutely.
And the ultimate outcome is going to depend heavily on the very internal contradictions and technological leaps we've discussed today.
The tension between those dual realities, the gravitational pull of the old system and the rapid, messy construction of the new one, is going to define the economic landscape for the next century.
To return to our opening thought, for decades, the entire world has blindly relied on a single electrical grid for its financial power. Now, we are watching nations actively build their own generators.
We sure are.
Whether those localized generators can eventually link up to form a genuinely parallel global grid, or if they will simply remain backup power for a few isolated houses trying to keep the lights on, is a question that remains to be answered. We will leave it to you, the listener, to decide which reality is taking hold. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.